Hi, folks. Thank you for tuning into our webinar about intellectual property and the COVID vaccine. My name is Ilya Levine. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and European Studies at the American University in Bulgaria. This webinar is part of my university's water cooler conversation series, which we started this semester after we switched to online classes. Partly we did this because it's another way of maintaining connections within the AUBG community. But also we did this because these webinars have been a means of providing our students, our alumni, and others with access to some expert multidisciplinary views on the COVID crisis, which is the defining crisis of the present moment. The series has, I think, been pretty successful. When my department, the politics department, had their webinar, we ended up getting close to 5,000 views in total, which is pretty good considering that this is academics talking and answering questions for an hour. And this is on the internet where people are one or two clicks away from cat videos and videos of drunk people hurting themselves. That's what we're competing with. So pretty good, I think. I think it reflects well on our AUBG community. I think it reflects a real interest in intelligent, informed, reasonable discussion. I think there's perhaps not quite enough of it these days, particularly when I look at cable news. Now, up to now, all of the webinar participants have been members of our faculty. Today, we're doing something different. First of all, today it's a debate. That's a little bit different. Secondly, we have two very interesting speakers from outside of the American University. They are associated with the Free Market Roadshow. So first of all, my thanks to the Free Market Roadshow and to the Austrian Economics Center for supporting this event and connecting us with Adam and Antony. I'm also grateful to Luca for handling the IT side of things, and I'm grateful to our Dean, Robert White, who organized this whole thing despite having much more than enough on his plate already. Most of all, of course, I'm grateful to our two speakers. One of them is Antony Sammeroff. He's a Scottish podcaster and blogger and a kind of anti-Andrew Yang, as far as I can tell, having authored the book Universal Basic Income, For and Against. Antony argues against, and having also earlier this year, when people were still having live events, having also earlier this year participated in a Soho debate on automation and what that will do to the labor market, on whether the robots are going to take our jobs. Antony was arguing the optimistic side. By the way, it's on YouTube. I already watched some of it today. It's an interesting debate. It's an example of that kind of civil, thoughtful, rational, well-informed discussion that I think we really need. I think both participants in that debate did great. Antony is a critic of intellectual property. He will be debating Adam Mossoff, who is a professor of law at George Mason University. Professor Mossoff's scholarship has been relied on by the United States Supreme Court and by US federal agencies. He's also testified before the US Senate and the House of Representatives on intellectual property legislation. Adam has also written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Forbes, and other outlets. In addition, because that's not enough, he is a senior fellow and chair of the Forum for Intellectual Property at the Hudson Institute. I actually like the Hudson Institute. They do good work on Central Asian politics. He is a member of the board of directors of the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding and a co-chair of the Technology, Innovation and Intellectual Property Program at the Classical Liberal Institute. And he is a supporter of intellectual property rights. So the topic today is, do intellectual property rights facilitate or impede the development of a COVID-19 vaccine? We're going to follow this format where Adam will speak for 10 minutes. Antony will then speak for 10 minutes. Adam gets a 5-minute reply. Antony gets a 5-minute reply. And then we will take questions from the audience. If you have questions, please type them on the Facebook page. That's, I guess, broadcasting the debate. Please include the names of the people to whom you are asking the question. Now, I guess I could talk about how very important the COVID vaccine is and how the COVID crisis is a very big deal, but considering how we're doing this debate, I think we already know, right? So perhaps it might be better if we just start with Adam talking for 10 minutes. And when you have 1 minute left, I'm going to start waving this sign from my webcam. And I will, if you go over time, I will absolutely bust in there like the Kool-Aid man, just interrupting everything. But away you go, please.
Thank you, Ilya. And thank you to the Free Market Roadshow and to the Austrian Economic Center and to the, of course, the American University in Bulgaria for inviting me to participate in this great discussion. I prefer to think of it as a discussion with Antony because it's among friends here and who we agree on foundational principles, and we have this interesting, I think, disagreement as to how these foundational principles are applied ultimately. Now, of course, as Ilya mentioned, right, we are in the course of a massive pandemic today, one unlike we haven't seen for about 100 years. The frame of reference is the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, it's very clear, however, that the pandemic today with the coronavirus is not going to be a repeat of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And that is because an entire industry that now exists, that didn't exist in 1918, the biotech and biopharmaceutical industry, has risen up in response and deployed incredible amount of productive labor and man hours in terms of coming up with solutions and treatments for this new I apologize for that, for this new virus that we are experiencing. Just to give you a sense of what we've seen deployed in the healthcare market in just the past 16 weeks, more than 400 unique drug programs have been launched, testing 101 experimental vaccines with 138 programs specifically directed at the COVID-19 virus. Private sector investments are responsible for more than 90% of vaccines and treatments in development to address the COVID-19. And of course, more than 70% of this R&D is being undertaken, in fact, by small companies. Now, all of this massive investment, billions of dollars, tens of thousands of labor hours, of scientists, researchers, business persons, is all made possible by property rights. The property rights that facilitate commercial exchanges in the marketplace, what is called licensing in intellectual property context. Now, of course, when I'm specifically, these property rights are patents, which are property rights in new inventions and discoveries. And like all property rights, patents secure the fruits of productive labors, in this instance of innovators, of scientists, of researchers. They incentivize productive labor to create new values in the first place, like all property rights do. And in fact, the biopharmaceutical industry is an incredible example of this. Over $149 billion was invested by the private companies in R&D in new drugs, tests, and ultimately vaccines in 2019 alone. Studies show that on average, for each successful drug that makes it to the healthcare market, there's more than $2.6 billion in research and development that has occurred over 10 to 15 years on average that backs up that new drug. I mean, that's sunk costs that they have engaged in, that they need to recoup in order to remain in business. And in fact, one drug on the market represents on average up to 10,000 original molecules that began to be investigated in the basic research by researchers at companies like Pfizer and Merck and others, as well as in universities. And studies showed only 1 in 4 drugs actually recoup this original R&D investment and make profit to continue to fund ongoing R&D. In fact, all of this makes clear, I want to make clear, right, that R&D is in the biopharmaceutical industry is extremely risky, it's extremely time intensive, it's extremely labor intensive, and occurs over the long run. It's been analogized for many years to prospecting for oil, right? Very risky, high upfront expenditures, and lots of failures. And more importantly, though, because you could incentivize those types of activities with other types of legal mechanisms that have existed through the years and through most of human history until we had a free market. You could incentivize them through prizes and through patronage and through tax subsidies and things of this sort. But those types of alternative mechanisms don't do what ultimately patents achieve, which is patents actually provide our property rights so that they facilitate and provide a platform for investment and ongoing innovative development in the marketplace between individuals who are acting on the basis of these property rights, entering into commercial exchanges, embracing the division of labor that facilitates and grows a flourishing innovation economy and ultimately is the basis for a free society. Right? Now, in my opening remarks today, I'm just going to quickly give kind of an overview of kind of the historical, legal, and kind of ethical context for intellectual property that I think will then provide a nice funnel for the responses that Antony and I will have and the questions that we'll get from the audience. And I think it's important just to kind of set this broader context because I found in discussions with my fellow advocates for the free market and advocates for classical liberalism and laissez-faire capitalism that sometimes there's a lot of confusions about what is intellectual property and particularly what are patents. Now, I just want to start a note at the outset that economic studies and historical studies continually show repeatedly that the same principle that we all recognize for property rights in other contexts, whether personal property or property in land or property in corporations and things of this sort, applies for patents. This material actually was wonderfully combined in a very short essay called Patents and the Wealth of Nations by a Stanford political scientist. His name is Steve Haber. I highly recommend it. You can find it on the internet at the ssrn.com website. If you just Google his name, though, Stephen Haber, Patents and the Wealth of Nations, he just does a quick survey in 20 pages of all of the studies and economic studies that have shown this. Now, this isn't surprising. The protection of property rights under the rule of law, we have long recognized among us, right, that this is the foundation for flourishing free markets, for growing innovation economies, rising standards of living. And these general correlations that have been recognized for property rights in land and in other types of assets, right, have been recognized in patents as well. You have the exact same correlations over history between countries and between innovation economies, advanced innovation economies, and freer economies like the United States has been for many years until recently, and as comparison to other countries as well. Now, the historical point here is equally important, right? So in principle, right, as an historical recognition point and as a point of ethical theory, right, you can recognize that patents as property rights secure the fruits of productive labors of innovators, right? In the same way that a property right in land, what we call in the law real estate, secures the fruits of productive labors of a farmer in the 17th century, or a property right in a factory secured the fruits of productive labors of an industrialist in the 19th century. Now, you can see how this works in the same way. A farmer engages in that same upfront expenditures of effort and productive labor in creating a new value. Farmers spend about a year, right? They till the soil, they fertilize the soil, they plant their seeds, they husband the crops, they reap the crops. This is a lot of activity over a span of a long time, and they reap their crops. And then they have a property right in their crops. So then they can enter into market transactions with wholesalers and retailers to more efficiently distribute their crops in the marketplace, reap the benefits, and continue doing what they're doing. This is what Adam Smith recognized in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, that division of labor specialization is the key to flourishing free markets and flourishing innovation economies more generally. So, and the same principle continues and is recognized in the 19th century, right? The industrialist spends a long time, sometimes up to a year or even more, setting up their what we now call a value chain, the whole supply chain, distribution chain, retail chain aspects of their manufacturing processes, building their factories, getting all the machines, entering into all of these complex transactions. This is why your iPhone doesn't say built in Northern California, it says, or Cupertino, California, it says designed in Cupertino, California, because it's actually built in by Foxconn in China through transactions in the marketplace. And industrials are able to engage this because they have property rights, and the property rights secure to them the fruits of these productive labors, and therefore they are able to engage in market transactions and sell their products like their iPhones and other things in the marketplace. And you saw this in the 19th century in just numerous examples of innovators creating new products and entering into the marketplace with them. So Cyrus McCormick's invention of the first mechanical reaper, Eli Whitney's invention of the first cotton gin, which vastly expanded farm production. And made it possible for people to work in the growing factories and no longer work on farms. Isaac Singer and Elias Howe's inventions of the sewing machine, and Samuel Morse's invention of the electromagnetic telegraph. Thomas Edison's inventions, of course, of the electrical light bulb and electrical distribution systems and motion pictures and things of this sort. So ultimately, the point here is that the same principle we recognize for real property, it provides the same legal protection, and as a result of that, provides the same economic benefits, right? And this is ultimately the point to recognize, is that property is simply a moral and a legal concept. It's an abstraction, right? Property refers to kind of the valuable assets created through human ingenuity and productive labor. And what property rights secure in society is a sphere of liberty in which one can control how one uses the valuable assets that one has created through one's productive labor, like trading with others and contracts, right? In fact, you can't have contracts without property rights. This is like a principle I teach to my students in my first year property course every year. And so through human history, this concept of something to control and use and benefit from one's valuable labors, right, has been expanded as the range and scope of human value creation has expanded as well, right? So of course, tens of thousands of years ago, there were just personal goods. First, those were actually the very first property rights were in personal goods. Then it was expanded to include land as we started to farm and create cities. Then it was expanded to include commercial activities and more advanced complex commercial mechanisms and institutions like corporations, and even more advanced commercial arrangements like multinational corporations and assets and credit and all of the things that we now benefit from in our advanced commercial societies. This value creation is based on innovations and creative labors, right? Is the kind of innovations and creative labors that identified in the 19th century innovators, Cyrus McCormick's mechanized reaper and Thomas Edison's light bulb, right? And so it's unsurprising that as you see societies protect property rights, right, you see explosions in free markets and economic growth and flourishing societies in the 19th century. And the full protection of new property rights and the creation of new values includes the protection of the property rights in the inventions and creative works that underlie the use of even things like land, right? As I mentioned, the mechanized reaper and the tractor and all of these things go into what makes possible for us to efficiently convert what was once fallow, useless land into a value for human life. And this legal and market framework in the biotech industry is what's made it possible not just for the investments to create new tests, drugs, and vaccines for the coronavirus, but it's also makes possible the creation of market mechanisms, the contracts, licenses, and other commercial arrangements that will ultimately put these new innovations into the hands of patients and other individuals throughout the world. So thank you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Antony has to say and continuing our discussion.
Thank you, Adam. You don't hear and you don't see a lot of commentary that's sympathetic towards pharmaceutical companies. I feel like they tend to be painted as a villain.
Yeah.
Antony, let's hear from you.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be invited, and thanks, Adam, for putting your jukes up today to give me a little bit of an intellectual stretch, right? So, a long time ago in America, whenever someone tried to fly a plane, the Wright brothers took them to court, and they won, and that put a stop to that. But in the meantime, the Wright brothers themselves had stopped developing aeroplanes. And why was that? Because they were spending all of their time in court instead. Only in 1917, when the First World War broke out, America realized that the Germans and the British had really good air forces. Even the Turks had a great air force. And the USA was lagging behind. So FDR, not a popular president amongst libertarians. Admittedly, he was then the Assistant Secretary of State for the Navy. He introduced a compulsory patent pool. And then between 1917 and 1975, there were effectively no patents on aviation in the United States. You could still file a patent, and they might even grant you the patent, but you couldn't actually stop any other aviation company from copying your innovations. So suddenly the aviation industry in America flourished. So there was patents in aviation between 1903 and 1917, no aviation, and then no patents between 1917 and 1975, and America grew to have the best aviation industry in the world. Okay, so will intellectual property help or hinder the development of a COVID-19 vaccine? It's kind of a hypothetical question, but there's some reasons to believe that it will stand as an impediment. So if we, economists like starting with desert island analogies. So before we get into the specifics of the pharmaceutical industry, let's just imagine we're in the state of nature and we have access to our hands and our heads, and whatever we want to put together, we can put together. If I see someone creating a fishing net for the first time, I can try and replicate making the fishing net. Or I can, if I can't figure it out, I can go over and talk to him and ask him to show me, and he might even charge me to teach me how to make the fishing net, right? But once I know how to make one, I can sell that fishing net on to someone else, some other poor sucker who doesn't know how to make one, right? Does the guy who originally taught me how to make the fishing net have the right to say, whoa, 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 whoa there? I got here first. No one else can make a fishing net, right? And what if the next day, the guy who I taught or sold my fishing net to has improved on the design and he wants to market his new advanced fishing nets? Does that first guy have to go, well, actually, I think you'll find I invented the basis for your innovation on the fishing net, so I'm going to have to stop you there by force? Should they have to ask for permission to innovate? Because if they do, that sounds like a pretty strange way to encourage innovation. So in the world where a third party, namely the government, interferes with our right to improve on the designs of other people, by force if necessary, are we more likely to see medical progress or less likely to see that? So when it, I would just like to state that the burden of proof is on Professor Mossoff to argue for that the imposition of a third party is going to speed up progress, because as we know, usually when the government get involved, it slows things down. So and on the point on property rights, Adam would like to define intellectual property as completely the same kind of property rights as the other ones we recognize, but he misses the important distinction, which is, if you own the land, I can own the land. If you own the factory, I can own the factory. A pen can be property, but how to make a pen is just ideas. It doesn't come under the same constraints because it's not non-excludable. So Professor Mossoff says that his main argument is the massive investment that is put into pharmaceuticals is only made possible by intellectual property rights. And that is a claim which he will require to prove, because if you look at the period that he's talking about, the state has massively grown. And most free market oriented people think we would have much more wealth and much more growth if the state hadn't grown in the last 100 years. Or, you know, when America first started, it was a protectionist nation, and people like Noam Chomsky like to say America was built on protectionism. We like to think that America would have been even more rich if it didn't have those tariffs and subsidies. So to say that we had intellectual property rights and that caused this innovation is very tenuous for reasons that I want to expand on. For one thing, a lot of companies just won't enter the race because they're too scared that at the last minute they'll throw tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars at something, and they'll be beaten just by a few weeks by a competitor. Second, imagine that I'm slaving away somewhere in Bangalore, India, and my team come across a new vaccine and we're just about to administer it in India, and then we find out that a Russian group filed the patent a week before, and we're not allowed to administer our own treatment, right? So that is patently absurd. One of us had to get that joke in, so I'm sure Adam's heard it a million times, right? For another thing, intellectual property rights may already be stopping them from accessing and building upon research that's already been done for others. It can be impossible to access, or the royalties can be prohibitive. And what about the combinations of different innovations? So the more elements there are to a treatment, the drug itself, the vehicle of delivery, the binding agent, and what have you, the more a company will have to run around asking everyone involved in permission to combine, to create their new treatment. Patents are clearly a grease in the gears of the market. They're slowing down innovation, and copyrights can also infringe upon people's ability to quickly publish research. So a lot of people do think that the pharmaceutical industry gives the best case for patents because bringing a new drug to market can cost up to $800 million. And because of a lengthy gap between discovering something and being able to market it, sometimes the monopoly effectively lasts for only 12 years, right? So they need a profit motive. But the thing is, the regulatory system for approving drugs is so onerous. And Mary Ruhr, who I've had on my show and kindly contributed a chapter to a book that I'm writing on healthcare reform, she wrote a book called Death by Regulation on how over the top these controls have become and how people die because of them. So when Dr. Mossoff says that only a quarter of drugs make a profit, that's partly because the government basically intervenes to hobble the pharmaceutical industry, and then they throw them a pair of crutches, which we call intellectual property, a patent, and say, aren't you glad that you can walk again? Mary Ruhr is of the opinion if the time that it took to approve a drug hadn't gone from 7 years to 17 years, which it has, there would be no such need for these patents. So that's an argument for getting government out of the way and not for patents, right? On the other hand, right, how much time have I got? Sorry.
Oh, you got another minute or
Oh,
three
geez.
if you take 12 like Adam.
Okay, well, I'll take 12.
Go ahead.
So basically, drug prices are way more expensive in America, about over twice as other 19 industrial nations. And the most important factor allowing manufacturers to set high drug prices was market exclusivity. So people have less access to drugs because of patents. I just want to say a few silly things about the way the patent system actually works. So if you look at a lot of patents or corporations can basically do what is called evergreening or repatenting of their products by just tweaking them slightly. The manufacturer of Prilosec, a heartburn remedy, managed to extend their patent by getting a second patent on the pill's coating. And this thing kind of happens all the time. A study said that between 2000 and 2015, at least 74% of the drugs associated with new patents in the FDA's records were not new drugs. They were just different versions of existing ones. So companies can then withdraw the original drugs, forcing physicians to issue the new, more expensive one. So if anything, the patent laws are deterring innovation by incentivizing companies to fiddle around with already existing treatments so that they can evergreen them rather than developing new ones. In fact, only 238 of 1,035 drugs approved by the FDA between 1989 and 2000 contain new active ingredients that were given. So all of this stuff costs tons and tons of money, right? Not only not only that, but patents lobbyists have worked long and hard in the pharmaceutical industry to extend what can be patented. And shouldn't these companies be spending money on researching drugs rather than lobbying the government? It represents a massive waste within the system. So in conclusion, it's merely an assumption to say that high expectations of profits due to monopolies lead to more pharmaceutical research and consequently more drugs. It's as silly to assume as to assume we're richer because government got bigger over the last 100 years. The effect could be the complete opposite, since monopolies very rarely innovate unless pushed to. And what is a patent but a monopoly right granted by the government? There's very compelling reasons to think that they are stultifying innovation rather than contributing to it.
Thank you, Anthony. Adam, 5-minute response.
All right, great. Yes, thank you. So, Anthony made some really great points, and I'd be remiss if I didn't respond to just a couple of the historical points and economic points, just because that tends to be an area I do a lot of my work in.
Sure.
So, the aviation patent example, which is one often hears, in its conventional wisdom, what he repeated. I mean, you find it in textbooks. It's in my patent textbook that I use in my patent law class. It's actually false. There's a really great article that was written that was released in 2018 called "The Myth of the Early Aviation Patent Holdup," in which scholar Ron Katz-Nelson discovered that FDR and other government regulatory officials who wanted to take these patents during World War I created this story of this holdup, created the story of this diminishing ability to innovate as a way to justify the government stepping in and eviscerating these property rights and taking over the aviation industry for all intents and purposes for several years. And that he actually shows in data that actually innovation was proceeding apace. There was incredible amounts of productive activity. And the United States led the world in aviation technology, as Anthony rightly recognized. And in fact, jet engines and all the follow-on technologies that made aviation what it is today, and hopefully we can enjoy the benefits of it soon again, we're all patented. We're all secured to their innovators as the property rights that they developed. I would also recommend him updating his $800 million R&D point. The 2.6 billion number was from a study by economists at Tufts University. That was released about 1.5 years ago. But he's certainly right that regulations are a source of a lot of problems. I agree with him. The FDA it shouldn't exist. It's a blockade. But regulations are also a source of a lot of problems, not the patent system of the things that he's talked about. The drug prices are high in the United States, not because of the patent system at all. It's because the rest of the world has nationalized healthcare systems. And the governments, through their course of power, force the biopharmaceutical companies to sell their products in those countries at less of a price. And so the U.S. is the last country in the world where they can essentially, I mean, it's not really true. I mean, over 50% of healthcare in the U.S. is still purchased by state and federal governments, but where they can still set their prices and they have to recoup their massive investments in the first place. And so this is the place where they have to do it. I mean, this is the classic public choice story
told on an international scale. You know, the British politician or the Scottish politician is accountable to Scottish voters. They're not accountable to the U.S. voters. So they tell U.S. companies that are innovating and creating these products, well, you have to sell your product at a cost where you can't recoup your investment. Well, they're willing to sell it anyway because some money is better than none, and then they just raise their prices the only place they can still raise them, in the United States. So this isn't the patent problem. This is actually a problem of national healthcare systems, of regulations through the FDA and the other types of things that Anthony identified. But I do want to hit back on a more fundamental point about the burden of proof point, right? Because I wanted to get this out there, and I want to repeat it again, that the same exact statistical correlations that we identify with all property rights, including land, because one cannot find a statistical study that proves as a matter of causation
economically or statistically or otherwise, that property rights and land lead to economic development. We recognize it as a principle of through our knowledge of history and our knowledge of political principles and of economic principles more generally. And this correlation we see again occurring in countries that have property rights, have economic growth, have freedom. And the exact same correlations exist for patents, because patents are not monopolies, they're property rights. I mean, I recognize that, that patents grew out of monopolies, but guess what? Property rights and land were originally monopoly grants by the state. All legal rights originally grew out of monopoly grants by the state. And I really want to hit on this, that property is this concept that encompasses the creation of all valuable labors. You have different types of protections for different types of property, whether it's air, land, whether it's in money, whether it's in credit, whether it's in telecommunication waves. And so, of course, you have different types of protections because you have different types of values in those assets and how they're used. Lastly, there is actually direct evidence of immediate causal connections between recognizing property rights and innovation and economic growth and growth of industries. And the biotech industry is one of those examples. The United States took the lead among all of the world in 1980 with the U.S. Supreme Court called Diamond v. Chakrabarty, where the United States Supreme Court said genetically modified organisms and other byproducts of the nascent biotech industry are patentable. And immediately venture capitalists and others started investing money, and you had this explosive growth in innovation. And all of the byproducts of this that have benefited everyone and have benefited the innovators themselves through this. This is the same correlations you expected we saw in the United States, where the United States government said, we'll protect people and their property rights. And you had explosive growth in the 19th century. The real hockey stick graph that everyone really should care about, which is the incredible impact that freedom and property rights have had on human life generally. And patents were very much part of that story as property rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. You clearly know your audience, taking a swing at FDR at the beginning. I'm looking forward to seeing how Antony responds. Antony?
I wasn't expecting to hear FDR and Chomsky being invoked.
Yeah. Well, sorry to compare.
That's okay.
Right, okay. So I guess I have to come back to my fundamental points. Before I do that, the chief scientific officer at Bristol Myers Squibb, Peter Ringrose, told the New York Times there were 50 proteins possibly involved in cancer and that the company was not working on them because the patent holders either would not allow or were demanding unreasonable royalties. How widespread is this sort of thing, right? Fundamentally, I didn't really hear an answer to my sort of net analogy, which was like, a lot of companies aren't going to enter the race because they're too scared that they'll throw hundreds of millions of dollars at something only to be beaten by someone else. And how can someone say that they don't have the right to administer? I know we're going slightly off the COVID point, but I think it's okay because what we're discussing here is the general principle. The intellectual property rights, as per my example on cancer, may already be stopping people from accessing information or parts of innovations that will help them to develop a vaccine, and that will be stopping people from combining elements of different treatments. What's more, even if we were to somehow prove that patents do speed up innovation, and I've got real reasons to think that isn't true. There's a lot of literature on the chemical industry before patents and how in Europe chemical companies were fleeing from one country to another country to get away from patent laws, and how it killed certain companies, it killed certain industries. I can't go through an exhaustive account because I don't have time to do that. But even if we could somehow demonstrate that patents were speeding up innovation, you also have to account for the massive cost of this system, from lawyers, court systems, government bureaucrats, litigious claims, and all the lobbying money. If this is producing 700 million of innovation for every 1 billion of costs, it's not actually contributing to well-being. All of this money, to tie in with the theme of today's podcast, that they're spending running around, it could be spent on developing new treatments like a COVID vaccine. As I said, all these massive costs of putting through a drug that's already been patented because it's got a new covering or because it's at a slightly second dosage so that they can re-evergreen their patents. That's money that's not going to develop a COVID vaccine, since they're just tinkering around with things that they already had. As I mentioned, a very large percentage of treatments, right? Now it might be, even if we take out the fact that the excessive costs of development are caused by government and compliance with regulations. If we could take away these costs without a patent, even if the pharmaceutical company was gaining less profit per drug, they may be gaining more profit overall because they are able to bring more treatments to market. They're able to compare their results to those of other people and maybe take someone else's drugs and re-engineer it to have less side effects so that it's less damaging for the human being that takes. But no, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. So I think it's highly dubious. I can only come back to the point to say that correlation doesn't prove causation. We've seen a lot of progress in the last 100 years and a lot of things we wish we didn't have, like world wars and the excessive growth of government, and in my case, intellectual property, which I'd rather we had grown without.
Thank you, Anthony. Folks
you.
watching, feel free to submit your questions. Please specify for whom the question, to whom the question is directed. In the meantime, I thought maybe I could ask Adam to respond to some of Anthony's points, because I think Anthony was saying that you haven't entirely engaged with his point about evergreening, for one thing, and you haven't quite engaged with this point about how impede may be getting in the way of improving existing treatments.
Yeah, so here, the important point, I think, is to remember the foundational and the point of principles. Because for every statement or anecdote or story that he can create about that patents are causing problems, right? One could find the exact same statements and stories about how property rights in land cause problems, right? Marx famously said, a hungry man is not free. The farmer prevents the person from getting food. The factory owners is oppressing the workers because the workers have no choice but to work, and therefore they can't get money. And we don't accept those stories as just on their face value. We don't think from anecdote and hypothetical and counterfactual as in, oh, well, all we need to do is, get rid of property and the state will wither away and there will be a wonderfulness for everyone in our socialist paradise. We actually recognize that there's actual correlations, historical and economic and otherwise. And as I said, if we applied if libertarians were skeptical of IP, applied the exact same standards of proof to real property that they apply for IP, they couldn't advocate for IP because you have the exact same stories of blockades. You have the robber barons. You have to explain how robber barons weren't robber barons. No, we don't. Yes, were there potentially some industrialists who behaved improperly with their property rights, who beat up workers, who took advantage of people? Yes, but is that fundamentally challenge the underlying principle and insight of what property rights do for society generally, and what property rights are facilitators of innovation, facilitators of commercial exchanges. And this is the United States' actually contribution. The United States was the very first country historically that took the position that patents were property rights, that they weren't monopolies. This was part of the U.S. exceptionalism. In fact, they were very explicit about this, that that they were breaking from England in part on this point, and that therefore people could transact with it in the marketplace. And in the same way that we recognize that property rights, yes,
A property owner can exclude someone, can stop someone, can hold up someone. I can use my property right in my house and say no to a commercial development that an economist will show, and economists have shown, and this is what justifies the use of eminent domain in the United States sometimes, that will lead to more economic development. And I can still say, no, it's my property and I want to live here, and that's my right, right? You can have those stories with real property, as you do sometimes with patents and other types of IP interests, but that doesn't undermine or challenge the underlying principle that property rights drive and facilitate. They are expansions of opportunities. They don't shut people down. When you look at,
but that's to beg the question, Adam, because that's the point you're asked to demonstrate. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I get it, and I think I have. I mean, in identifying the fact that patents as part of a system of rule of law with stable political legal institutions, not as privilege grants, not as monopoly grants, as the United States took the approach to. When you look at the explosive growth of the U.S. innovation economy and the facilitation of new, even innovative commercial developments, the whole franchise business model was innovated by people like Samuel Morse and others who were licensing their intellectual property to others in order to take advantage of specialization and divisional labor. And when you watch shows like Shark Tank, right? What's one of the questions of the venture capitalists? Venture capitalists who are not government, these are not people who are seeking government handouts. Ask of the people whenever they have an innovation, do you have a patent? Because the property right is the basis for their investment in them, in the same way that your house is your basis for your mortgage.
Yes, but they're laboring in a system where patents exist. It would be a different program if they weren't. So the point that you make is that you keep on coming back to property rights, and you throw intellectual property rights in with the right to own land or a factory. And the thing is, intellectual property is incompatible with property rights, because if I've got a printer here, I can't use my own damn printer to print what I want, because a government official is going to come in the window and say that I'm violating a law. So actually, and how does anyone even know in the lab in Russia if they're infringing on someone's supposed property or right or not, when they're trying to develop a similar treatment to what the people in the factory in India are? If they develop the treatments independently, where does this right come from to say that you cannot do that? I just can't first of all, I can't admit that point.
This is one of the misunderstandings. A person in Russia can't violate an intellectual property right in India. The intellectual property, just like all property rights, are national.
So
you come up with something,
I mean, that only goes to say that
now countries can enter into treaties with each other,
okay,
which they do, just like with their real property, and say, you need to respect our property rights in our country, just like you respect yours in your country. But that's an overlay on top of what is already purely domestic protection of the property rights of people who are accountable in that jurisdiction only.
Okay, so I apologize for my mistake in that area. This is not my area of specialization. Just move the example from to one lab on the west coast of America and one lab on the east coast. It still seems like a gross injustice. And secondly, to say that they vary from country to country just shows how arbitrary the whole concept of intellectual property is. I mean, I once again, I can't own this pen only in America, but not in India. It's really, it really makes it sound a little bit silly. That's.
So again, remove intellectual from your statement, and it applies just as equally to all other property rights. Property rights are defined differently in India than they are in Russia, than they are in the United States. That doesn't make property arbitrary. It means that there is a legal component of defining it, and we would hope that countries, they don't today, but we would hope, right, that countries would recognize what is fundamentally what property should serve, and they would therefore recognize and adopt uniform protections. But I mean, they don't, because people have volition and choice, and they create different countries and different regimes that are unjust in various capacities, and they define them differently. But ultimately, and and your hypothetical about the researchers, applies to the same. Two people have invested 200 years ago invested what would in today's equivalent be hundreds of millions of dollars to get their ships and to sail at the exact same time to new land, America. And they don't know who the other person is doing it. And the one ship arrives one day before the other ship. And
Right.
and we don't say, oh, this is so the person who arrived first shouldn't have the property right in the land just because they happen arbitrarily to arrive first. That was the arbitrariness of the winds and of the ocean.
Right.
Things of that
Well,
sort.
I think it's not a winners take all situation in that. I mean, the second ship can go a bit north and claim some land, but
And
the point is this.
By the way, you can do that in intellectual property. So this is one of the really cool things about the U.S. innovation and intellectual property is that patents are published. And the reason why they're published is for several reasons. Is that you can so that people can do what we call design-ing. You can they're not economic monopolies in any sense of the term because people create competing products. I like to say is a joke kind of, first there was it's not. I just lost my joke. First there was the male erectile dysfunction pill, and then there was a competing product that came out a couple of years later that didn't infringe the patent because they were able to develop a competing product because the patent doesn't protect the idea. I know we say that colloquially, and lawyers do and everything, but that's just a colloquialism. It's actually not what the law does. You're only protected in the actual innovation and invention that you created. It has to be new. It has to be non-obvious. It has to be useful. And that leaves open a lot of alternatives. And in fact, this is what you see in the biopharmaceutical industries, a vibrant competition with competing products and services and competing drugs. And part of this is driven by the disclosure mechanism of the patent system. Even patent applications are now disclosed even before patents issue. But the point is that, and I want to emphasize this, is that we can argue over counterfactuals, but the point is you can't prove a counterfactual. You can no longer prove a counterfactual than I can.
Sure.
And the argument we get into with the statists and collectivists is they always want to say, well, it would be paradise on earth if we had communism. And
I don't think it's a fair analogy.
Sorry, guys.
Because,
let me just pause you there a little bit.
Sorry, could I just have a moment to make a point?
Yeah.
One thing is with your ship analogy, the point is, would more people be likely to set sail knowing it was a winner-take-all scenario or not? This debate is about whether intellectual property helps or hinders the development of a vaccine. I would say that it hinders it because there's a lot of companies that simply will not put up the goods under the spectre of being pipped by the post and not being allowed to bring that treatment to the market. So with that point, I would like to take questions since we've been given our marching orders.
Thank you, Anthony. We have a question for you, Anthony, from Nanyan Zhang, who asks, how do people trade technologies on the market without intellectual property rights ownership and the corresponding protection? How would that actually work?
I don't actually fully understand the question, I'm afraid to say. As far as I can see it's what you see is what you get. If you can build a item of technology, you can trade that item of technology, but it can't stop anyone from copying it. I would think that, I mean, and I'm not really sure what she's talking about, but I remember earlier on during the debate, I thought to say, I find it hard to believe that we wouldn't have better technology and even better laptops and phones than we have just now if there weren't just a small number of companies operating in that sphere, big companies operating in that sphere because of intellectual property. So I guess you'd have to do the best you can with what you have, I suppose, right, is the only answer. If she can clarify the question a little bit more, then maybe I can give up.
For example, I mean, I'm thinking in a world without IP, companies could still try to, hold on to their company secrets, couldn't they? If they have a particular production process, would KFC, for example, be able to keep its, what was it, 12, 15
11 herbs and spices.
secrets,
That's not,
spices,
Yeah.
that's a trade secret.
secrets?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
would
look,
companies?
this is what happened before intellectual property existed, right? How did companies and organizations keep their information protected that was valuable, that was commercial? Well, that was the guild system, which was, not a system that facilitated economic growth or facilitated actual commercial exchanges. I mean, the guild system was the only way that they could protect their interests and rights. I mean, this is one of the ways in which IP systems actually promote and facilitate economic growth is through the actual publication and disclosure of this information that didn't exist under the guild system. In fact, guilds killed people if they disclosed information to other people historically. So in this, I think what the questioner was asking is that the point I referenced in my opening remarks, that when I teach property, property is not just you get to own it something. It's a set of rights of exclusive control, and you can have overlapping rights, and we create people who have future interests, and I can give a partial interest in something. If you rent a home, if you rent your current home or apartment, you have a partial right that's been conferred upon you by the property owner. Now you have overlapping property rights in that piece of asset that is now owned. And this is what property facilitates. But those are all what we think of as contracts. In fact, most people, before they go to law school in the United States, they think leases are contracts, and they're not. They're actually property interests in Anglo-American law. They're estates in land, and so excuse me. And this is, so I think what she's asking is, well, if you don't have this kind of ability of defining exclusively how you can control something, what is then the basis for people to enter into free market exchanges? Because if you can't say no at the end of the day, if I can't get an injunction against someone trespassing on my house, then that person is not going to ask permission to come onto my property. They'll just come in. They'll be a squatter.
Right. Well, I resist the analogies to physical property for the same reason that I come to again and again. Intellectual property is not excludable. It's like if you have an idea and someone else has the same idea, you still have that idea. Whereas if someone trespasses on your property, then you don't effectively own the house unless you have, well, I mean, they don't get you don't get a second version of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So that I just want to, that's just more for people listening to know. I really, really resist those examples. I don't think they are illustrative of the debate we're having. So I guess, yeah, people can sign contracts with their staff to make sure that they've agreed not to disclose information, and they can try and keep it as hush-hush for as long as possible. And I don't think anyone can reverse engineer a pill overnight or anything like that. But fundamentally, the intellectual property as an institution is going to infringe on your right to use your own lab, your own equipment that you bought, your own ingredients, and people are going to come and say, no, sorry, you can't research that on that with your own property. It makes your actual property no longer your own property, and I can't see how that is going to lead to innovation. Like, imagine I could create that pill in my own house, in my own, like Dexter's Lab, that cartoon I used to like when I was a kid, for my own child to take it, if I had the know-how to do it, and no one knew. Is it a violation of someone else's intellectual property or not? Like, where's the line here? I'm not allowed to do what I want to do with property that's supposedly mine. I know I've strayed a little bit far from the COVID thing, but I just come back to the same point again and again, which is people aren't going to risk that in fact, they're not allowed to use their own property to research a COVID vaccine, or at least they're significantly deterred by the prospect of someone pipping them to the post.
We have
yeah.
another.
Ilya, is there another question?
Yeah, we have another question from Nadia, it's for whoever wants to answer it. She's asking, what advice would you give to businesses and organizations that want to protect their valuable intellectual property during this pandemic? And I think perhaps she's referring to the fact that we're currently in a crisis, and in a serious crisis, there's a tendency for people to trample over any norm, rule, law, or principle that gets in the way of a perceived solution to the crisis.
If only they would do that for minimum wage laws and labor laws and all the things stopping people.
Well, you'd have to convince people that they're in the way.
Yes,
I know.
yeah. I mean, if you know, if we could just show like that, how the FDA is the one responsible for there not being, in the United States at least, and not enough treatments and not enough drugs and not enough masks. That's the real problem,
Yes.
you know, and these excessive government regulations that actually are killing people right now. I mean, you know, we usually argue, well, you know, this has an impact socially, and in the long run, this harms people. But like, this is leading to a body count now. And unfortunately, you're right. I mean, and as Antony recognized too, right? You know, crises are often the basis and justification for expanding government power over people's lives. There's a very infamous statement by the chief of staff for former President Obama in the United States. He said in 2011, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And he literally meant what that sounds like. He said, you know, we should use a crisis to expand our power. And he was very, and that's why it's a very famous or infamous, I believe, statement.
I saw a comment, I forgot from whom, stating that instead of changing the world, what COVID is doing is accelerating the tendencies, the patterns that were already there. So the tensions between the US and China, people working online more, the death of the traditional movie theater, and so on and so forth. I wonder, is this going to be a further blow to intellectual property rights? Because I think intellectual property is already in trouble thanks to China.
Go ahead, Antony.
No, I was just saying thanks to me. Very, very unlikely, not with intellectual heavyweights like yourself, Adam, to defend it.
Oh, you're all too kind.
Yeah,
no, I mean, it could potentially be a blow because insofar as countries, especially the United States, for instance, you know, there's been a lot of government officials who've said we are, you know, if you invest billions of dollars and thousands of man hours of labor to come up with a new cure, we're just going to take it from you because we're in a crisis. I mean, they've been very blunt about this and very open about this. Well, you know, if you say to a farmer, right, you know, hey, go ahead, produce your crops, but if there's a famine, we're just going to take your crops from you. Or if we think that there are some people who happen to be hungry, who are starving in the city at the moment, and so we have a crisis, and we're going to take your crops from you without your permission. I mean, is that farmer going to farm? You know, is that farmer going to say, all right, great, I'm going to keep farming. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing? No. I mean, the moment you say to people, I will use any what I define as a crisis. We are in a crisis now, but I mean, we are not in something like where the world is collapsing. I mean, COVID-19 is a serious illness, but it's not the plague. You know, which, you know, killed 30% of the entire European population, and you know, it's not, you know, it's not SARS, which, you know, the severe advanced respiratory syndrome, which had I think a 12% death rate, you know, as opposed to a 0.5% death rate, which is what is appearing we have with COVID-19. So if, you know, when they say however we define a crisis, we're, you know, all bets are off. Rights of liberty in the United States, where we've locked down, you know, rights of property, we're going to shut your businesses down, rights of intellectual property. the lesson, the moral hazard from that is clear. And the lesson from that is, well, then why should I produce if what I ultimately create for myself and live my life for is only at the behest of my superiors in the government?
Anthony?
Well, I'd agree that under the current system, when this is done kind of spontaneously, that might have a negative effect. But what we're talking about is the fundamental point of what the culture should be like. And people will have different expectations when they know that they can't be expected to be awarded a monopoly on an innovation, and they can't stop other people from copying their ideas and improving upon their ideas. So with that point, yeah, there's huge amounts of money involved in bringing a drug to market. As we've discussed, a lot of that is because of the regulatory structure. If the regulatory structure was not such, then there would be more companies operating in the field, because more companies would be able to, and that would be a better world, because we'd be more likely to get a treatment for this faster.
Thank you. There's another question from Irida. She's wondering, I think it'll be more of a question for Adam, because this might be a question about where you would set the limit to what can be patented, to what can count as IP. So she's wondering what you would think about a person seeking trademark protection over, for example, COVID or coronavirus. I think that the very words.
Yeah.
Would we have to pay 10 cents every time we said it?
Right. No, that's a great question.
Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, line drawing is
a good
important.
question.
It's very important in all property rights. In fact, 99% of what I teach every year in my property course in my law school is about where you draw the lines, because the property rights are just the rights in the use of something, and so we often think of fences and things like that as defining the boundaries of the property right, but that's only in one area and one small aspect of how we define property rights. And this is a big area in IP, right? Because you should only get protection for the thing that you've created, and what makes it not a monopoly, what has shifted it out of the monopoly were the evolution of the creativity and innovation requirements, or invention requirements. And it has to be something new in the patent context. And then they added useful, and even has to be non-obvious. So something could be completely new, but if it's totally obvious, the example I use when I teach patent law is, if someone invents the bicycle, which they did, and they got a patent on it, and then someone invents the tricycle, well, that's obvious. That's not deserving of a patent. But in trademark, you have similar types of restrictions. You can't trademark generic terms. You can't and you can't even trademark descriptive terms. Unless they acquire additional value and meaning through your productive labors as a company in selling trades and services in the marketplace. So a term like COVID-19 or other scientific terms would be deemed to be either generic or purely descriptive and not trademarkable, unless you define a very, very limited, narrow commercial context in which you were, potentially using it. But and you would have to do it in that context. So you have to create what's called goodwill. That's a legal concept for the valuable business reputation that companies create in selling products and services in the marketplace, as represented by their products and services with their consumers. It's a legal concept. It's an abstraction. It developed in the 19th century, not around IP, but because it's a broader concept. It applies in corporate law, it applies in bankruptcy, it applies all sorts of areas. It's the value that exists in a commercial enterprise that is engaging in those incredible activities and selling goods and services in the marketplace, and that there's a value to that that's distinct from the actual particular values of the goods and services. In fact, when companies are bought and sold, goodwill oftentimes constitutes well more than half of the total price that the one company is paying for another company for purchasing another company. And that's really a broader point too, is that IP doesn't block in more way than property rights in land or property rights in water or property rights and other things block people, which they do. I can say no to a trespasser. Or if I own property rights in a stream, which have existed for time immemorial, I could say no to someone who wants to fish on that stream. That's certainly true. But what they actually facilitate, and this is Adam Smith's incredible insight and Schumpeter's insights and others, is that, and the Austrian economists as well, is they actually facilitate, they're a platform for engaging, they're a foundation for cooperative exchanges in the marketplace. And studies consistently show, just in the United States alone, that $4, $5, $6 trillion a year is generated in commercial exchanges between and amongst companies, including in the biopharmaceutical industry. It's actually not true that biopharmaceutical companies want to just keep their pills and treatments to themselves. They engage in extensive amount of commercial interactions with other people. And I know this not because I'm an academic or a specialist. I know this because I wanted to learn more about this. I wanted to understand this industry. I didn't just want to kind of pontificate about it, from up in the clouds as a professor. I actually wanted to learn about it. So I actually started talking to people who work in the industry. It's like, well, what do you do? How are you deploying your products and services in the marketplace? And this is why, you learn such things like there's 101 experimental vaccines currently being tested for COVID, which is on the foundation of a market structure and that exists, that has been facilitated by the investments and the market developments that have been possible by property rights, the patents that have existed, that Anthony's saying we shouldn't have. The burden of proof is on him. Where would those 101 vaccines come from if they didn't have that structure that was created by the US stepping in 1980 and saying you can patent these types of innovations?
Okay, thank you guys. We've Anthony, do you want like a 2-minute response?
Final response. I shouldn't be allowed to end on that.
Right. I just want to say that I totally reject the idea that the patents don't block in the same way that, in any way that regular property rights don't block. It's true that you can block someone from swimming in your stream, but what if you develop a new way of boating on your stream? That's going to interfere with who I let boat on my stream if I am lucky enough to own one. So yes, 100 companies are working on a vaccine. That's great. Should only one of them prevail, should only one of them be able to market their research once they succeed? If someone independently comes up with the same idea, it's kind of like when someone goes, has that chair got your name on it? That idea's not got your name on it. It just exists somewhere in your head. And to say that someone else can't then use their own ideas, I just can't see. I mean, we would really need a counterfactual to see, a world Earth 2 where we didn't institute intellectual property. But I think I've given good reasons to think that that's not the only way of looking at it, and people will naturally come to their own conclusions and give us both feedback. Thank you very much, Adam. You've been very lovely to talk to and given me plenty of food for thought. And I hope that I didn't just say a bunch of stuff that you've heard before.
Oh no, this was really great, Anthony. I really enjoyed it. I hope that we should do this again. Definitely, it was fantastic.
That would be.
And I did, and you did come up with some new points I hadn't heard before. You did make me think on my feet a bit. I enjoyed that.
Okay, grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much for having both of us.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. This has been really great. You both gave us, you both raised some really interesting points, some from very different points of view, some from intersecting points of view. And Anthony, good luck with your pursuit of getting to own your own stream. I heard it's the happiest day in the man's life when he gets to own his own stream. So maybe that's boats. I don't know.
We can host the next debate from a boat on the stream. That is the dream.
Right. As long as you invent the
I
boat.
am now incentivized to come up with a new method of voting on Anthony's stream. That I'll get a patent on.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Really great.